Prof, ada 3 more minit, Prof. Sebab saya masih menunggu lagi yang lain untuk masuk.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. So, okay, Prof. Boleh kita mulakan, Prof?
Boleh.
Boleh, Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and good morning to all. Welcome to Seminar Intellectual Discourse 2.0 2020 session. This morning we will have a talk from an experienced lecturer from Department of Professional Development and Continuing Education, JPPL. He's the Prof. Dr. Lateef Krauss Abdullah. For your information, this seminar will be recorded and published into Facebook, Faculty of Educational. For those who have attended today's seminar will be given an e-certificate. The link for the Google form will be given through the chat box at the end of this seminar. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Abdul Lateef for his speech. Welcome, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much, Haikal. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good morning to everyone. So it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces on the screen. Familiar names, I should say. I don't see any faces yet, but hopefully we'll see some faces later in the program. So I would just like to thank the faculty for inviting me today to this second of our series of intellectual discourse sessions for students. I'm privileged and honored to be giving the second in a series, a three-part series on mixed methods research. So I am following my esteemed colleague, Dr. Kaiser, who gave the first intellectual discourse a couple weeks ago. And his talk focused on parallel design within mixed method research. And so I will be doing today the second in the series on sequential mixed method design. So in terms of the program itself, I don't plan to talk very long, hopefully just an hour, hour and a half. And for those of you who do know me, you know, I like a discursive style. So at any time, at any point you have any questions or you want to make a comment, feel free to jump in. I welcome interaction as we go. Okay, so with that, I will start by sharing my screen. Oh, I'm sorry, Haikal, I'm not that familiar with WebEx. How do I share my? I cannot share my screen. It just says share file.
Oh, Prof, there's the button share below. You
Yeah,
can see
yeah.
that?
So, yeah, I click on share and it goes to share file.
Oh, I see.
I
Wait,
cannot share screen. Tak boleh share screen.
Wait, Prof. I call Farhan. Wait,
Dekat top left ada button share, Prof.
Top left.
Boleh ada share content.
Top left. I don't have a share content top left. I only have share at the bottom. It says share content at the bottom of the screen. But when I press on that, it only gives me an option of share file. Tak ada share screen.
Sekejap
Pak ni kena buka dah sini Pak. Kena aktif kan.
Sekejap. Tapi dah buka dah ni semua.
Do I need permission or something?
Sekejap. Host. Cuba try lagi sekali, Prof. Saya dah bagi jadi presenter.
Okay. Okay. So let's see. Okay. Alhamdulillah. Thank you. Okay. So can everybody see my screen? Why is it not maximizing?
Yes, Prof. We can see.
Boleh.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, so mixed method design, we're going to be focusing today on just the sequential designs. As I mentioned, Dr. Khaizir gave us a nice introduction overview to the parallel design. So now we're going to move to the other major group of mixed method type of studies, which is sequential design. So the agenda for the program today, my talk is going to be, I just want to give a little bit of the underlying paradigm of mixed method research. For those of you who have studied with me, you know I'm kind of a little bit of a nut when it comes to research paradigm. So I do like to just give a basic introduction about the paradigm of mixed method research. I think it's always important to understand why we are doing the type of research that we're doing, that there are underlying values and an underlying philosophy that goes with how we conduct our research. And then I'm going to present the two major sequential designs, okay, just the sort of definition and basic characteristics of those designs. And then I want to give some examples. I think it's really important and always useful to provide examples of these designs in action. Okay, so what do actual studies look like? What are the components of those studies? What makes them sort of unique? And then how researchers go about actually conducting them. And then if there's time, we can have some, of course, discussion on for those of you who are planning your own sequential mixed method studies. Inshallah, we'll have a little bit of time for that. Okay, so getting into the understanding of the paradigm that sort of provides the foundation of mixed method research. What I've noticed is that a lot of students sometimes they don't realize, and maybe it's just they haven't gotten that deep into the method yet, that they don't realize that mixed methods research has its own paradigm. That mixed methods research is not a combination of a constructivist and a positivist paradigm. Okay? That's really important to know because a lot of criticism of mixed method research stems from this issue. That philosophically, to mix a constructivist and a positivist paradigm, it's illogical. And so therefore, there are critics out there of mixed method research that say it doesn't make sense because of this. But when we look at mixed method research, there are really two major paradigms within the field that sort of provide the foundation of the method. And so we have to have at least a basic understanding of that, so that we don't get confused. So if we look at this question here, how do we understand the reality of a patient in a hospital, for example? And of course, this is a very topical question, given the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so, of course, many of us have this unfortunate experience where we have to go visit somebody in the hospital. And so, if we look at it from a research perspective, we might ask this question: how do we understand the reality, of a hospital patient? Okay, so we walk into the hospital, we walk into the room, and there is our uncle, our brother, our father, whoever it is there, and we really want to understand what is the reality of this individual that he is experiencing. And so typically when we attempt to understand the reality of the hospital patient, inevitably we will resort to a series of questions. Okay? And as you can see on the screen there, often the questions begin with these types of questions. Okay, so we may ask the doctor, for example, what's his heart rate? What's his blood pressure? What's his platelet level? Okay, maybe we're not that well versed in medical terminology, so we don't necessarily ask these questions, but maybe the doctor asks these questions to the nurse, for example. In any rate, if we want to understand what's happening to the hospital patient, we have to understand these sort of objective facts about the patient's reality, what he's going through, what is his status, okay? And so these indicators help us to get a sense of his reality from a medical, a sort of physical, medical, clinical perspective. However, we don't stop there. As concerned family members, of course, we ask a different set of questions, right? What we really want to know, we want to ask our uncle, our pachi, our ato, whoever. Ato, how severe is the pain? Does it hurt? Ato, are they treating you well? Ato, are you comfortable? How are you feeling? Okay? Inevitably, we will also ask these types of questions. So the doctor may tell us that his platelet level is crashing and his heart rate is through the roof and his blood pressure is too high. But then we may ask him, how are you feeling? And he may say, I'm feeling fine. Or maybe he's not feeling so fine. Okay. Inevitably, though, we will ask a series of questions that combines these types of both objective and subjective questions. Okay. And ultimately, we may ask the doctor, so based on this, what is his prognosis? Because the prognosis is often based on the combination of the two, right? His clinical signs are good, but he's got severe pain. And in fact, last year, my mother-in-law passed away, and she was of this category where she had clinically her vitals, her objective measures of her well-being in the hospital were all okay. There was nothing clinically that they could identify that was wrong with her, but she had this severe gastro-abdominal pain, and they could not really diagnose what the problem was. Okay, and that often happens. And so this is the beauty, and this is the the benefit of a mixed method understanding of reality, in the sense that we get a combination of the sort of objective indicators along with the subjective indicators. And that gives us, at least in theory, a more complete picture of what is happening in the setting that we're studying, among the reality of our participants, our study participants. Okay? So this is a sort of real life example of how a sort of mixed method philosophy translates into one reality. Okay, so paradigms do matter when it comes to research. We start with paradigm. From paradigm, the paradigm informs our methodology. For those of you who have had class with me, you should know this. And that methodology determines our method of choice. Okay, to make it more specific, the assumptions about how the world works, our assumptions about reality, the nature of reality, which is what forms the foundation of our paradigm. Methodology being the study of methods. Okay, it's the study, it's not the method itself. Methodology is not the method, it's the study of the methods, it's the science of the methods. Okay, and from there, that translates into our technical aspects of carrying out a research. In other words, our method of choice. All right. And this is the logic behind, this is the logical sort of ladder, the logical hierarchy of research philosophy. So for example, we have our paradigms of positivism, post-positivism. We have our paradigm of constructivism and phenomenology. Okay, and then we have in the middle, okay, the third paradigm, pragmatism and critical realism. Okay, so this translates into quantitative methods, qualitative methods, and mixed methods. Okay, so we know much, I'm sure, about positivism and post-positivism. That is what is the foundation, forms the foundation of our quantitative methods. And for those of you who have taken qualitative research, you know that underlying qualitative research is the paradigm of constructivism and phenomenology. And so undergirding mixed methods is a paradigm known as pragmatism. Another one is also known as critical realism. Okay. In a lot of the mixed method literature, they talk a lot about pragmatism, and that, similar to the hospital example I just gave, pragmatism is a very pragmatic way of understanding reality in sort of all its dimensions, right? It's more technical and more quantitative indicators and dimensions, as well as the more subjective, intrinsic dimensions of everyday life. Okay, but what I want to present is an alternative to pragmatism, which is something a little bit deeper than pragmatism, and it really helps me to understand the value of mixed method research. So pragmatism is based on this idea of paradigm relativism. So the use of whatever philosophical and or methodological approach that works for the particular research problem under study. Okay, and this is sort of what many mixed methods researchers base their choice of method on. Basically, whatever works, given the particular questions that you have. Okay, right? So if you're in the hospital and you really want to understand, you know, both what is the clinical status of the patient, as well as how does the patient feel? Okay, well, those two questions require, you know, the appropriate method for each question, right? So you just combine them and you sort of get this mixed method study. And that's sort of the underlying idea of pragmatism. So going beyond that, though, methodological pragmatists claim that philosophical disagreements are not fundamental. Okay, so these philosophical disagreements, it doesn't matter. It's not that important. Okay, because research methods are not intrinsically linked to specific philosophical positions. In other words, most of us, when we do research, we don't think about philosophy. We say, what's the question, and then what's the method, right? So basically, that is where the pragmatists are coming from. You know, all this philosophical stuff, it doesn't really matter. You know, you don't have to pay attention to it. Methods can simply be combined based on their practical utility, all right? And these paradigmatic conflicts can be just ignored, okay? Like most of you students, you don't care about all this philosophy. You just want to, what do I have to do to get the PhD, right? Just tell me which method I have to use to answer my questions so I can get my PhD. Okay? And so a lot of researchers sort of take that same approach, is that whatever works, whatever's practical, right? So because of this, pragmatism has been promoted as the appropriate philosophical stance for mixed methods. And this is, you'll see this a lot in the literature as well, this idea of pragmatism. But I want to propose that there's something more to it than this. And I think people that, especially scholars that have looked at another approach called critical realism, I think it provides a better understanding. Okay, so we have this idea of quantitative versus qualitative. Okay, so on the left, you have your quantitative research based on this positivist and post-positivist paradigm. Objective, right? It's studying objective reality, where literature review is done early and it tests theory, analysis by numbers, using instruments, measures, quantitative measures, and the idea is to go for generalization. And on the other hand, we have qualitative, okay, based on the constructivist and interpretivist paradigm. The literature review is ongoing, and you're there, and you're trying to develop theory, and your analysis is of text, words, and ideas. The researcher is the instrument, and you are going for uniqueness. These two could not be more different. Okay, they could not be more different. Well, mixed methods, specifically from a critical realism perspective, recognizes reality and the importance of meaning. Okay, it recognizes the reality and the importance of meaning, as well as the physical and behavioral phenomena, as having explanatory significance. In other words, it tries to actually bring together the quantity and the quality in a single paradigm, in a single study. All right. So it's not just a little of this and a little of that. It actually, there is a way to integrate that gives it meaning. Okay, so the quantitative researcher will say, well, you know, context, study context, it doesn't matter. You know, this naturalistic inquiry and all that stuff, it doesn't really matter. We just control. We have what's called control variables, right? So we can control for all these environmental factors in our study. And then we can just focus on analyzing those variables that we're interested in. Everything else we just control, right? Context is not important. The qualitative researcher says, well, our methods, we don't really allow for generating causal explanations. And even in our courses, I had my qualitative research class last night. We often say this in our qualitative research courses. Well, in qualitative research, we're not concerned with causality. You know, we're the touchy-feely types. We're not really concerned with what causes what. We just want to know what people experience. You know, we want to describe and understand meaning and all these wonderful things. Okay. And it's true, we do in qualitative research. Okay, so these are considered to be the limitations of both of these approaches. Quantitative, we cannot really understand context. We cannot really understand the meaning of context and how context comes into play in a study. Okay, qualitatively, we are limited. We cannot make causal. We cannot really generate causal explanations. We can generate theoretical propositions and generate hypotheses, but we cannot really that well, at least, generate causal explanations. So Maxwell and Mittapalli, who are critical realists, they say for the social sciences, the social and cultural context of the phenomenon studied are crucial for understanding the operation of causal mechanisms. In other words, we must consider the context when we look at causal explanation. It is really important because this is the social sciences. Nothing happens in a vacuum. You know, people that do those laboratory experiments, especially a lot of you clinical psychologists, you know, you put these children in a very, very, very controlled environment and you study their reading behavior or study their relationship with their parents in a very extremely controlled environment. That's not the real world. You're controlling for so much of the real world. But it's often those real world contexts, the social and cultural contexts, which actually have an impact on the causal relationships. Okay? So critical realism goes beyond just the whatever works pragmatist approach and says, actually, we have to look at it a little bit deeper. That these contexts, these contextual, naturalistic factors actually have an impact on the causal mechanisms. So we need to take them into account when we do our research. So critical realism is actually an integration of a realist ontology, which underpins the positivist research paradigm, The idea that there's a real world out there that exists independently of our perceptions, theories, and constructions. Okay, that's the positivist view of the world, and the constructivist epistemology of qualitative research. So it tries to integrate these things. Okay, the idea that our understanding of the world is inevitably a construction from our own perspectives and standpoints, and there is no possibility of attaining a God's eye point of view that is independent of any particular viewpoint. That's the constructive epistemology. So critical realism tries to integrate these things. How? By proposing that there is an objective reality in alignment with the realist ontology that is understood and experienced subjectively. Okay, so the integration of the realist ontology with the constructivist epistemology, bringing the two together rather than just taking a little bit of each. Okay, so it's actually an integration of the two. There is an objective reality. We can agree that there is an objective reality that we are all experiencing, but how we experience it is different. Okay, and so we can include both of these elements into our research. Okay, and that is the beauty of the critical realist paradigm in mixed method research. So the benefits of embracing this paradigm and conducting mixed method research is that it recognizes the explanatory importance of the context of the phenomenon studied. It does not simply reduce context to a set of extraneous variables, okay? So it does not reduce context into control variable 1, control variable 2, etc., like we do in a lot of our quantitative studies, all right? So that context is, and we as social scientists, we cannot argue that point. It is very hard to argue that point, to say that context is not important. You just control forward and so forth. Yeah, that is a natural limitation of any quantitative study in the social sciences. It relies on an understanding of the processes by which an event or situation occurs, rather than simply a comparison of situations involving the presence and absence of the presumed cause. Okay, so it takes into account that there are social processes, rather than just comparing or looking at correlations between variables, that there's a deeper process going on there that we also have to consider. Okay, so we can test our relationships, we can test our quantitative relationships, but we have to also realize that those relationships are embedded in a social context. Okay, and we have to account for that somehow in our research. So it supports the idea that individual social and physical contexts have a causal influence on their beliefs and perspectives. Okay, so a lot of people, I know a lot of social scientists, they are a little bit uncomfortable sometimes because they realize that there's limitations in the fact that they're, you know, a lot of it has to do with culture, all right? So especially in this culture where maybe we feel like we're borrowing theories from Western culture and so forth, and we feel like we're missing stuff. We feel like we're missing out on something. You know, I know this theory's been tested in the West and it's very effective there, but I think in Malaysia it's just different, you know? But we're not really sure how. We don't know how to put our finger on it. We don't know how to incorporate it into our research, right? And so then maybe we jump to a qualitative approach where everything is context, everything is culture, everything is, but then we feel like we're losing out on the, you know, the power of the quantitative test, right? To explain, we're losing that explanatory power of our research by doing a purely qualitative study. Okay, so this is how we can begin to mend. We can sort of bring the two together. So let's look at a real world example. Okay, concrete example. So we have this example. So we have this relationship between, for those of us in education, this is a very common topic, school engagement and grades in school. Okay, school academic performance, in other words. So the quantitative question, does greater school engagement predict academic performance? If students are more engaged in school, do they perform better? Simple correlational analysis. Okay, does school engagement predict academic performance? The qualitative question might be something like, what are students' experiences of school engagement? What is their experience like? How do we describe what it's like to be engaged in school? Okay, what is the meaning of engagement? And all that goes with it, because we're taking a naturalistic approach. We're taking a naturalistic perspective. So we want to just understand school engagement. Okay, And maybe, just maybe, at the end of our study, we can make some hypotheses about the fact that, based on what we heard from our respondents, it is, quite possible that school engagement will produce or will lead to higher academic performance based on what we heard from our participants. But that's not really the goal of the study. But that might be one of the outcomes of the study, this hypothesis, right? Now, if we look at it from a mixed method perspective, you can see there the arrow showing the relationship got thicker. The arrow got thicker. Why? Mixed methods, the mixed methods question might be something like this. How do students' experience of engagement in school influence their academic performance? Now, what allows us to make that kind of a question, devise that kind of question, is because we are first testing the relationship to show that there is a relationship. Generally speaking, we're going to say, generally speaking, yes, the data shows school engagement predicts grades in school. And then we're going to do the qualitative portion of the study to try to explain why. Okay? So it takes the best of both perspectives, all right? It tests the relationships and then tries to explain why. Now, of course, we do not try to explain why with that full quantitative sample. That's impossible. Well, not impossible, it's very difficult. It would take a very long time, and it'd be a very big study. So if we do the quantitative portion of the study with 1,000 students, we cannot obviously do in-depth interviews with 1,000 students. So we take a sample from that 1,000 and we follow up with the qualitative to try to understand why. Okay. And so this will give us a richer understanding of the relationship, and it will help us to at least draw some initial conclusions about why or how students' experience actually influence their academic performance. Okay. And so this is just one example. Okay, so I'd like to stop there. Are there any questions before I go on? Any questions, comments? Nothing so far? Okay, I see there's a comment in the chat box, although I don't know how to open the chat box. Oh, here it is. Okay. So Ling Tianwang asked, how can we make sure the weightage of mixed method? Okay, I'm gonna discuss that in a little while, the weightage of the different types of studies. So just hang on to that question, okay? Ling, just hang on, and then if I don't answer it later, you can ask me again, okay? All right, so I don't see any other questions, so I'll continue. So the three major reasons for doing mixed method studies, especially sequential, but we're going to first just give an overview. So according to Creswell, and everybody loves Creswell, it's probably the most cited, at least in qualitative research and mixed methods. The first major reason for doing it is to get more information or better information can be learned from converging or triangulating the results than from one method alone. And so for those of you who are doing mixed methods, and I thought I saw Ho. Ho, are you here? Mr. Ho? I saw your name on the screen. Is Ho here? No, he's not. Okay. So Ho, Mr. Ho from our...
Yeah.
Hi, Ho.
Hi, Prof.
You just finished your Viva. What are you doing in this talk?
To learn more also, Prof.
So Mr. Ho just finished, and he just successfully completed his Viva the other day, and he also did a mixed method study. Okay, it was a very comprehensive study. Did a nice job. And so, like for example, in his study, the amount of information he got from his study, combining both qualitative and quantitative, was really impressive. Okay. And of course, that also means that for those of you who are planning on doing it, and I'm going to ask Ho to give his impression of doing a mixed method study in a minute. But it does require more work because you have to first of all, you have to first know both methods, and then you have to, of course, execute both methods. Okay, so it's going to be inevitably it's going to be more work. okay? But it's going to also yield more information, okay? And in many cases, better information. Results from one method can be extended by using another method. And so this gets to the question of weightage, okay? And what we're going to see in a minute is that you do not have to give equal weight to both quali and quanti within the study, okay? Third, quantitative measures and instruments grounded in the views of subjects or participants in the study can be developed, okay? So for those of you that want to develop new measures, quote unquote, from the ground, from the setting, you can do so using mixed methods, okay? And so that's exploratory. The exploratory sequential design allows us to create sort of homegrown measures for us to conduct in our studies. So of course we have to be aware of the challenges of doing mixed method research. Okay, so there's no, of course there are more now, and this is as the field grows, we get more sort of guidelines as we go, but there are not like quantitative research at least, there's no definitive guidelines for how to conduct a mixed method study. It is the newest of the sort of methodological paradigms, and it's still developing. And so there are different guidelines depending on which authors, which scholars you refer to. Integrating multiple data sets is a complex task, okay, especially when you're dealing with different methodological traditions. So the challenge of integrating the data is a big one. And so that's one of the greatest challenges of doing mixed methods. Carrying out the methods, that requires planning, and that requires paying attention to methodological rigor. It has to be rigorous in how you conduct the quality and the quantity. But the bigger question of what you do when you get the data, right? And there's no simple answer to that because every study is different and unique. And so how you integrate data really depends, again, on the questions you're asking. And then, of course, how you foresee, how you plan ahead in doing that. There are challenges in publishing mixed method studies due to page and limits in journals. Okay, so for those of you doing mixed methods, of course, you need to publish for your KPI for your thesis, completion of your thesis work. It is a challenge. In fact, I just had this experience recently trying to publish a mixed method study. It took me 5 journals eventually to get it submitted because of a variety of reasons. One, some journals don't accept mixed methods research, okay? And so I had a rejection based on that, and I wasn't aware of it. I had another couple that the word length, it was too long. The article was too long, and the journal rejected because the article was too long. Okay, so it is a challenge to publish and to write a really good mixed method paper within a limited amount of space. Mixed method research requires a larger skill set, okay, than a researcher who only uses quality or quantity. Okay, and that's quite obvious, but it's something you need to pay attention to because there really is no such thing as a half-baked study. You cannot really study a little bit of quantity, a little bit of quality. It doesn't really work that well. You need to have a strong working knowledge of both. At least in the quantity, I would say you need to have at least a strong working knowledge of the particular analysis methods or analysis approaches you're using. So for example, if you're using SEM in your mixed method research, you really need to study and know SEM. And if you're doing like a case study in qualitative research, for the qualitative part, you need to understand case study research, all right? And you need to understand mixed methods research, okay? Which is why it does take more time and require a larger skill set, okay? Because you need to know both. Mixed method research takes longer, all right? In most cases. Now, that does not mean in every case, because we have single method studies that take very long as well, but in most cases, it's going to take longer, all right, and require more resources, obviously. Okay, so these are really important considerations if you're planning on doing mixed methods research that you need to pay attention to. If you're on scholarship and you only have 6 semesters, I would strongly recommend not doing mixed method research, okay, for the simple reason that, as you can see on the screen, there are constraints in terms of time and resources. All right, so think about that. Okay, so part two, let's talk about how we actually integrate these designs. And I'm gonna, of course, this talk is gonna be focusing on the sequential designs only, okay? So when you're designing your study, there are, according to our scholars, there are some important questions you need to ask, okay? And this will help you to design your study. What is the rationale, okay? What is the rationale of my mixed method study? Is it dictated by data? In other words, do I have access to good mixed method data? Is it driven by the objectives or the research questions? Or are you using it to complement? You know, you have a strong qualitative study and you just want to complement it with quantitative, or you have a strong quantity, you want to complement it with quality. Okay, so what is the rationale for doing mixed methods? And you have to have a strong rationale. Don't just say, I want to do mixed methods because it looks sexy or it looks cool or, you know, whatever, or I think I can get published with a mixed method study. Those are not good reasons. There should be a strong rationale. What is the structure? Okay, so how are the methods going to integrate? Okay, and that really needs to be thought through. Again, not only on the structure of which is going to come first, quality or quantity, and then within quality and the quantity, what methods am I going to use specifically? How am I going to analyze my data? All that. But then what are you going to do with the data? At what point are you going to merge the data? Okay, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the structure? What is the function? Is the goal convergence of findings, provide complementary explanations? Are you trying to expand upon previous findings? Are you developing an instrument? Or is it merely for sampling purposes? Okay, so this is, of course, related to rationale, but it's more functionality. Okay, what is the function of the convergence of methods? All right. And so, like I'm going to refer to you a lot today since I saw you here. So. And we don't get, honestly, we don't have a lot of UPM students that are doing mixed methods. So when we have successful mixed method studies, we want to highlight our students that do them. And so like in Mr. Ho's thesis, he did a very nice qualitative study, followed by he designed an actual app. Okay, and so he followed that up with a experimental design. Okay, so he did a qualitative followed by an experimental test in his mixed method study. Okay, so clearly he used the qualitative to develop the intervention, and then he carried out the intervention and tested the intervention. So the rationale for his study was very clear. Okay, and the functioning between the two parts was very clear. All right, it had a very strong research logic. Okay, which is really important. And then what is the process? Final, what is the process? So how are you actually going to do it? Will the data sets be merged together, connected in a sequence? Or is one data set going to be embedded within another? Okay, so what is the actual process of doing that? Okay, so these are the 4 questions that you need to ask yourself before you begin. Okay, before you begin your mixed method study. Okay, and what type of mixed method you use depends on 4 factors. Okay, so there's the theoretical perspective. In terms of theory, is your theory explicit or is it implicit? Are you clearly working from a theoretical perspective, or is that theory going to emerge? Okay, priority of strategy. Are you giving them equal priority, the quality and the quantity, or is one going to be prioritized over another? Again, is one going to be complementary, or are they going to be equal? Okay, sequence of data collection. Now, of course, we're here today, we're going to be talking about sequential. Okay, so we need to decide quality first or quantity first. Okay, concurrent we're not going to deal with today. Dr. AJ, Dr. Khaizer already dealt with concurrent design. So we're going to talk about quality first or quantity first, since we're looking at sequential methods. All right. And then finally, at what point are the data, as I mentioned, at what point are you going to integrate the data? At the point of data collection. Okay, if you're doing sequential design, you obviously won't integrate at the point of data collection. That's more for a concurrent design. Okay, for sequential methods, we will integrate at the point of data interpretation. Okay, once we've gotten both. So according to Morse, in terms of sequential design, there are, of course, 2 major sequential designs. Okay, So there's the explanatory sequential design and exploratory sequential design. But she first, the way her typology, she first looks at the dominant or equivalent sequential designs. So for example, if you look at this diagram, so the dominant method here is represented using the capital letters, and the complementary method is the smaller. Okay, so you have on top you have the equivalent sequential designs, where both are given equal weight. Okay, whether it's quanti first or quali first, they're given equal weight. In other words, they're of equal importance. However, you also have what are called the dominant sequential designs. Okay, and in that case, you may have the dominant portion of the study is the quantitative, and then you're going to have a complementary qualitative portion, which gets less weight. Vice versa, you can have an initial quantitative, maybe just a descriptive study to start with, but the emphasis is really on the qualitative findings, which is the big capital qual. Or you may start off with a very small, like I would even argue maybe in the case of, well, no, I think yours was more equivalent, but in some cases you may just do an initial qualitative exploratory study, okay? And that was sort of my experience in my PhD. I did a sort of initial qualitative exploratory study, but the focus, the greater weight was given to the quantitative portion, okay? And then again, at the end, you have the qualitative as the dominant, and then the complementary as the quantitative. So this is, again, in the same way that we talk about in qualitative research, the researcher has to make these decisions about their design based on how they conceptualize the study. In mixed methods research, you also have to make these kind of decisions. Is my study, is the quantitative more dominant, or is the qualitative more dominant? And which one am I giving greater preference to? And that's going to also dictate how you merge your data at the end in terms of your interpretation. So we start with sequential explanatory strategy. Okay, so this is the first of the two, the sequential explanatory strategy. The explanatory strategy begins with quantitative, okay, and then follows with qualitative, all right? And the idea here is that the qualitative explains the quantitative, thus the name explanatory. Okay, so we get a sort of generalized quantitative finding using our quantitative methods, and then we probe deeper to explain those findings using a qualitative method, okay, qualitative study, right? So that may involve, in terms of the qualitative, what we follow up on. We may follow up on, usually it's the findings. So once we get our quantitative findings, then we want to better understand those findings, okay, using a qualitative approach. But that qualitative approach, we can focus on different elements of the findings. We might focus on, for example, we're looking at sort of a correlational study. We may focus on further explaining the significant relationships. So we get significant relationships between certain variables. The qualitative may try to better understand the causal mechanism there. Why is there this causal relationship? Qualitative can be used for that. We may use the qualitative to better understand unexpected findings. Okay, the sort of serendipitous, as we use in qualitative research, we talk about serendipitous finding. Well, using this explanatory approach, we can use the qualitative to help explain these serendipitous types of findings. Okay, so what you focus on in terms of the qualitative portion really depends, again, on what it is that you want to explain. Okay, what it is that you want to explain, and the purpose of using the mixed method approach. So we start with quantitative data collection. We do the quantitative data analysis. We get our findings. Then we carry out the qualitative data collection, get our qualitative findings, doing the analysis, and then we interpret. Okay, so we will interpret together, essentially. All right, and that is sort of the process of the sequential explanatory strategy. Okay, one after the other. Okay, one follows the other, and they're done on a serial mode. The collection analysis of quantitative data followed by the collection analysis of qualitative data. Okay. Equal priority is given to the two phases. Okay. However, it doesn't have to be. Okay. In most cases it is. But like we showed in Morse's typology, you can give different weightage to the different portions of the study. Okay. Data are integrated during interpretation. Integrated during interpretation. And the one informs the other, right? So the quantitative findings will inform the qualitative. Okay, so what we study in the qualitative is going to be dictated sort of by what we get from our quantitative finding. The primary focus is to explain the quantitative results by exploring certain results in more detail or helping explain unexpected results. Okay, so for example, using follow-up interviews to better understand the results of a quantitative study, as I mentioned. The strengths of the approach, relatively straightforward due to clear, distinct stages and easier to describe than concurrent strategies. Okay, so Dr. Kaiser had the more challenging approach. Concurrent strategies can be quite complicated, especially in terms of how you integrate your data and analysis. Okay, whereas the sequential approaches are a bit more straightforward because it's one and then the other. Okay, so there's more distinct stages. A lot of the concurrent strategies they sort of integrate as they go, and it can be a bit more complex, especially in terms of describing what to do, what you're doing. Of course, weaknesses, it's more time consuming, obviously. Okay, especially when you're giving both phases equal weight. If you're doing a complete quantitative study followed by a complete qualitative study, of course, that's going to be time consuming. Okay, so that's one of the major weaknesses. Okay, so that has to be taken into account. So it'll usually take more time than a concurrent strategy where you're doing them simultaneously. Okay, so that's obviously one of the weaknesses of the sequential design. Right? Okay, so there's a question here. How can we indicate, oh, sorry, I lost the question. Oops. How do I get my question back? Oh, there it is. How can we indicate equal priority? Is it through the equal number of research questions? Yes and no. Yes, the research questions or objectives can be an indicator, yes, of equal priority. And then the other thing is you just declare it in your methodology section. You declare, it should be declared in the methodology of your study that you are giving them equal weight priority. Okay. So for example, if you're giving them equal weight, you know, you can't do a quantitative study with 35 participants and then a qualitative study of 30 interviews and say it's equal priority. Obviously, based on the breadth of each study, they're not equal. Okay, because you know, a very small quantitative study of just 30 people's, unless you're doing an experimental study, that's different. Okay, but yeah, that needs to be explained. How you're indicating equal priority needs to be explained in the method section. All right, and then also in terms of how you integrate the findings, the interpretation at the end is that you're giving them equal priority in terms of your interpretation, right? So there's a merging there. Is it compulsory to separate the objectives writing into quality method, objective, and quantity method? No, typically they will be separate. It's very difficult to write a single objective with both incorporated. So you'll have your, especially in a sequential design, it's usually very clear. You have your qualitative objective and then your quantitative objective, or objectives and objectives, depending on how many you have. So yeah, they will be separate. And I'm going to give you some examples here as we go. So let's look at one now. Here's first example of a explanatory sequential design. Teacher and peer support for young adolescents, motivation, engagement, and school belonging. Okay, so the research questions of the study, as you can see here, our primary aim was to examine teacher and peer support for adolescent adjustment in one large, urban, ethnically diverse, middle-level school. Two main questions frame the study. One, how do teacher and peer support relate to student motivation, engagement, and belonging? Followed by number 2, in what ways do teachers and peers support student motivation, engagement, and belonging? We employed a sequential explanatory mixed method design in which we examined associations among constructs using quantitative analysis and investigated perceptions of the ways teachers and peers support student adjustment using qualitative inquiry. Okay, so based on the question that was just asked, question number 1 is the quantitative study. Question number 2, the quantitative portion of the study, and question number 2 is the qualitative portion of the study. All right. So, and I know a lot of students say, oh, well, they started their question with how, so it has to be qualitative. No, it doesn't have to be qualitative. Don't get fooled by language, okay? In most cases, yes, qualitative questions start with how and why and what, but not always, okay? How you word a question does not always dictate what is the method being used, okay? So for number 2, in what ways do teachers and peers support student motivation, engagement, and belonging? So that's the qualitative question. In what ways? Now, of course, that's just another way of saying how, but they wrote it as in what ways, okay? So there's, in English, in language, there's different ways of writing these things, okay? And so question number 1, they could have said, what is the relationship between, right? Teacher and peer support and motivation, engagement, belonging. Okay, so they could have written that in a more traditional quantitative manner, okay? But it's quite clear nonetheless. Okay, so this is a very clear sequential explanatory design. Okay, it's first starting looking at the correlational relationships, followed by interviews to better understand those findings. Okay, so any questions about that? It's the sequential explanatory? Additional questions? All right, so I'll continue. Pull up. Oh, there's the chat. Okay, sorry, just learning WebEx. Okay, so the second one is the sequential exploratory strategy. All right, and as you can see here, the word exploratory gives the connotation that we're going to start off by exploring. Okay, which means we're going to start off with qualitative. All right. So we start with qualitative data collection. We do our qualitative data analysis, and then we, based on those findings, we do our quantitative data collection, quantitative data analysis, and we interpret. Okay, so same as the explanatory, just reversed. We start with qualitative. Okay, and there are many different types of exploratory designs. A common one is instrument development or measurement development. Okay, so you conduct the qualitative research first to identify the variables, and then you create an instrument out of those variables, and then you test the instrument with those variables. Okay, that's a very sort of common sequential exploratory approach. All right, so you can see here. All right, as I mentioned, equal priority is given. Again, you don't have, it doesn't have to be equal priority. It really depends, again, on how you conceptualize the study in terms of which one is more important and why. Okay, but again, there should be some rationale for that. And you'll see this in a lot of, it's quite common, there's, in terms of complementary approaches, you'll often see, at least in the sequential explanatory paradigm or method, a lot of studies, they'll do a sort of generic, sort of descriptive analysis. They'll do a quantitative survey, but it's very just descriptive. And then they'll try to understand certain aspects of the population by using qualitative. So for example, we're currently doing a study in UPM on youth worker supervision. Okay, youth worker supervision. So because there's been so little research on this area, we first want to just get a sort of landscape, a generic lay of the land. What is the current status of the field? In other words, what is going on in terms of youth work supervision? What's happening out there? So we're going to first do a very descriptive study, a survey. We're just going to blast it to youth worker supervisors and youth workers just to find out what are the current practices in terms of supervision. We have no idea, right? So we're actually going to start with a survey, okay? And then from there, then we're going to do follow-up interviews to better understand whatever we get back from the quantitative and says, well, we have these policies, and generically speaking, we do this type of practice, and then we're going to do follow-up interviews to better understand how it's practiced. Okay, so that would be an example of a sequential explanatory design where we're going to actually give more weight to the qualitative. We just want to get a sort of descriptive profile, and then but the quality is really where we're going to really understand what's happening in terms of supervision, what kind of practices they're doing, and all the different ins and outs, the different dimensions of practice and all that. Okay, so again, it depends on what the need is, what the question is, what the purpose is, what is the current state of the field in that area. Okay, these are all the questions that determine weightage when it comes to priority. Now, when it comes to sequential exploratory design, these are often used to test elements of a theory. So another popular use of exploratory design is when you want to develop a model. Okay, so you want to develop a model using qualitative methods, right? And then you want to test that model. Okay, now that is probably for a PhD going to be quite a big study. Okay, although arguably we could say, example, going back to Mr. Ho, he did something similar to that. He didn't develop a model, he developed an actual application, an intervention. Okay, but it would be a similar type of study where you develop a model, a conceptual model of something, and then you test that using a survey approach. Okay, so that could also be an example of an exploratory design. When you want to generalize qualitative findings to different samples, so you may get a qualitative finding among a group of teachers in one particular school, and then you want to test that with teachers in other schools. Okay, another very common approach to sequential exploratory design. So you do your case study, your in-depth case study, and you get some nice findings about what makes teachers happy in school. And then you want to test that with a broader, more generalized sample. So you conduct a survey, a more general survey with teachers in other schools. Okay, again, another way of doing sequential exploratory. And then, of course, development of an instrument. All right, so using a small group, developing an instrument, and then collecting quantitative data based on that instrument. Okay, so these are three of the major ways that, major applications rather, of sequential exploratory strategies. So the strength, again, it's relatively straightforward in terms of implementation because you have these distinct stages. Okay, it's one and then the other. And again, same thing, it is also time consuming. Especially if you're doing something like developing an instrument or developing, like Mr. Ho's study, developing an intervention, developing a theory. Okay, again, you can't really cut corners on that kind of a qualitative study. If you plan to develop a model about something, you better make sure that you've really achieved that clear saturation of that model, the data for that model, so that you can really make a claim and say this is a real model before you go and test it. Okay, so it is going to be a more time-consuming approach. Okay, so here's an example of a exploratory qualitative, a local study that we did a couple years back. This is actually a three-phase study. It is an exploratory sequential design, but we actually included 3 phases rather than just 2. So we started with 2 phases of qualitative research and then followed it by the last phase, which was quantitative. So in phase 1 of the study, we examined the policy context in Malaysia of youth associations, and we addressed the research question: what is the shared belief system that undergirds and directs youth associations? Okay, so we did a document analysis of relevant policies in the country, and we analyzed that qualitatively. And then in phase 2, we looked deeper into the perspectives of youth leaders of youth associations, and we explored the question: what aspects of the settings, the youth associations, are most closely linked to youth engagement? In other words, what is it about youth associations that spark or that promote youth engagement? And so from the results, we constructed a couple of measures, short measures on engagement. Okay, and so this was carried out using interviews and focus group discussions. Okay, so that is the first phase of the exploratory design, the qualitative. Then we followed up with phase 3, which was a quantitative design. Okay, and the question was what aspects of empowering settings, and that's based on a theory. Okay, that's based on a theory in empowering community settings theory. So what aspects of these empowering settings, youth associations, contribute most substantially to organizational and community engagement among association members? So we took the findings along with the theory and we merged them into our survey. And then we tested that survey with a sample of youth association members. So young people, basically, young people that attend youth associations. Okay, so the first phase, we had the documents, we had the policies. The second phase, we had the youth leaders. And then in the third phase, the quantitative phase, we tested our findings from the first part with the association members to look at the association between the aspects of youth associations and youth engagement. Okay, so you can see it's 3 phases, but it's actually the same method. It's the same design, which is the exploratory sequential design. Okay, so this is just another way of doing mixed method research. Okay, any questions? I saw a question in the chat box. Everybody is very quiet today. Nobody wants to speak. Everybody just wants to write. Okay, if the research is experimental mixed, should we include control group in the qualitative to understand a phenomenon? Yeah, okay, so I'm not quite sure. Kirshen, could you, if you're willing to speak, I don't know if you're willing to speak, but maybe you could explain a little bit more in terms of what design you're thinking about there? So yeah, I mean, if you're going to carry out an experimental study, a true experimental study, you definitely have to consider a control group, absolutely. But not within the qualitative per se. I don't know if that answers your question. The qualitative is the separate. So you're going to do a experimental, and then you're going to do qualitative, either whichever order, I'm not sure. You didn't indicate. But if you're doing a true experimental and you're doing qualitative, so the true experimental would have the control group, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm understanding your question clearly, and then the qualitative would be the qualitative to better understand the finding of the experiment.
I'm Kirshen, Dr. Steven.
Yes.
Because I'm currently doing actually it's a quasi-experiment research, and I already collect my data, but the situation is if I want to do the mixed method, right, to understand why the student, why the result is to understand the phenomena. So should I prepare the open-ended question for the control group as well?
Open-ended questions, you mean on the survey form that you're using? Open-ended questions, you're talking about interviews?
Like the follow-up question. It's a little bit like follow-up question.
In interviews, you're doing follow-up interviews?
Not interview, but like giving them the survey form so they can answer the open-ended question.
Open-ended question in a survey form. Okay. That's in the actual experimental phase.
A little bit like the mixed method, but yeah, it's in the experimental phase. It's in the experimental research.
Okay. Well, I mean, that depends on what you want to know. What is your question about? What are you asking them? So, for example, if you're asking them about the intervention, obviously you're not going to give that to both groups. You're going to give that just to the intervention group. Right? The treatment.
The intervention. Okay.
The treatment group. If the control group obviously the control group didn't undergo the treatment, so they can't answer any questions about that. So I'm assuming you would just give those questions to the treatment group if you want to find out
the treatment group.
what was it about the intervention that they liked or what they found effective, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Thanks.
So again, this has to do with research logic. Again, don't think of, well, I want to ask an open-ended question because I want to ask an open-ended question. Why are you asking the open-ended question? What do you want to learn? What is it that you want to learn about the intervention, or what is it you want to learn about the experiment? Okay, that is what is going to dictate your method, not the other way around. So don't think, oh, I want to do a mixed method study, so I have to ask an open-ended question. Gee, what should I ask? No, that's backwards. Think about, I'm going to conduct this intervention. Now I want to know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to ask an open-ended question. Okay, so think about what the question is you want to ask, and then you devise the method accordingly. Okay?
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Okay, sure.
Prof. Lateef, can I add a little bit?
Hey, Prof Siti, yeah, please,
Yeah,
please.
maybe
Chime in.
maybe in that experimental, mainly is the experimental is within the quantitative strand, but you might want to look into embedded design, mixed method embedded design instead of
Yep.
sequential.
Sure.
Instead of sequential explanatory, I would suggest you want to look into embedded design, whereby you embedded the qualitative, because this is an experimental, right? So when you do the experimental, you may have direct contact with the participants, you interact with them, especially those who are doing counseling. We actually interact with the client, we see the progress quantitatively during the counseling interview. So we get data that's beyond the questionnaires. And that is, we do that within the experimental, it's not after the experimental, rather the data that we collect is within the experimental design. So that is embedded. You might want to look into the embedded design, qualitative embedded in experimental design. So mainly is the quantitative. This is what I understood from your question. I understood you correctly.
All right, thank you, Dr. Siti. I'm doing the intervention actually, with students, so I have the control group also to understand the effectiveness of intervention.
So you might want to look the embedded design. Krauss
thank you.
I don't know how to has that, right?
That is
Thank you, Doctor.
more along the lines of what Dr. Kaiser talked about previously. I think Prof Siti, that sounds similar to what, maybe a little bit like what Sophia is trying to do. So I mean, conducting that qualitative as you go, while carrying out the intervention sounds like a better approach. Although, I mean, you could do it sequentially as well. It's really, again, it's really how you conceptualize it. And again, what are the qualitative questions that you're asking? That's really what's most important. What do you want to know about the intervention qualitatively, right? So Prof Siti and I had one student who was doing a very unique intervention where she really wanted to understand the experiences of the young people as they're going through the intervention. So she incorporated her interviews throughout the process, and that's what Prof Siti is talking about in terms of an embedded design, rather than you carry out the experiment and then afterwards. That's what Sophia did, right, Prof Siti? She did it as she went along, yes? Or did she wait till the end?
But she her design is not
Sequential.
experimental. Is rather qualitative, purely qualitative.
That's right.
No
Yeah,
experimental. Yeah, in
right.
this
But
case,
she
it's
did
experimental.
Yeah, she did do an intervention though.
Yeah.
But these are all, these are all important design questions. That's why when it comes to mixed method, there is no fixed design that you just apply. It really depends on how the study is envisioned and conceptualized, and what is most important for you that you're trying to learn. That's going to dictate how you formulate your study. I know for quantitative students, this may be a bit harder to understand than for qualitative students, because qualitative students, we're used to sort of thinking about these types of design questions, because a qualitative design is a much more flexible design than a quantitative design. Okay, and so mixed methods is a little bit like that as well. It's more flexible in that sense. It's similar to qualitative research. So I'm looking at some of the other questions in the chat. Creswell recommended 3 types of research questions. What is your idea about that? I'm not familiar with Creswell's 3 types of research questions. Would you like to share on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
What I mean is that Krauss, he recommended 3 types of research questions to be included in one study. That means whenever we are writing our thesis, we not only need to have quantitative research questions, qualitative research questions, but at the same time, we have to provide mixed method research questions. What do you think about that?
Okay. Can you give an example of what he means by that? Of a mixed method research question? I'm assuming he's talking about a question that speaks to how the interpretation of the findings are integrated.
Okay, one of the example that he provided is that I take one example from his book for exploratory sequential design.
Okay.
The mixed method research question can be, are the themes about self-esteem can be generalized to a population of middle school boys?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is specific to that type of study in terms of what he wants to learn. In other words, what is it that the mixed method design is trying to achieve ultimately? Okay, and so that's his overarching research question, right? And so that's particular to that design where he's trying to generalize his qualitative finding to a larger sample. So yeah, of course that research question makes perfect sense. Okay, so yeah, you can definitely have a question like that, no doubt. In fact, even in quantitative and qualitative studies, we often have overarching research questions, and then we have what are called sub-questions. Okay, and so that's also common in mixed method research as well. So you can have an overarching objective or research question that sort of ties the two, and it gives a sort of a meta view of what you're trying to achieve in the study, and then you have your quality and then your quantitative questions. In fact, I tend to often recommend to students to structure their research questions that way, regardless of what type of study they're doing, because I think it's important that you are clear about the overall goal of the study, and that's captured by that sort of meta question, that main research question. Okay, and then you have the specific questions, but sometimes we lose track of what we're trying to achieve when we focus only on the sub questions, right? So it's good to keep that sort of main goal, main objective in mind. Okay, so I think that's what he's getting at, and I think that's a very good strategy. Yeah, of course. How many times does the interview need to be conducted? Well, that depends. If you're familiar with qualitative research, you'll know that often the criteria for that is what we would call saturation. Although saturation is not always a requirement, especially in mixed method research. Again, it depends on the purpose of the mixed method qualitative part of the study. So, for example, like if the qualitative study is just complementary, the qualitative part is just complementary, of course, it is good to have reached saturation if possible, but that's not always possible in some studies. So you'd have to follow along the criteria of the method that you're using. So, for example, if you're doing a case study, there has to be adequate coverage of the case, all right? And that's not a quantitative criteria; that's more of a qualitative criteria. Okay, so it's really hard to say the number. It's hard to give a number per se. Is it when I build a psychological tool based on certain theory and then apply it, is it exploratory? No, that's actually not, that would not count as an exploratory sequential mixed method study. If you're just building a tool from theory, from literature, then that's essentially a literature review. So that would not count as a mixed method study. Okay. Okay, last question before we go on. Prof, I wonder whether the following is explanatory design or not. Using experiment to investigate the effect of a learning technology on the outcome. An interview will be conducted to explore the strategy students adopt when using the technology, which may affect the final outcome, such as how long they use it every time. Frequency, will they share their accomplishments to see the relationship between the strategies and the final outcome. An interview or interviews, I guess, will be conducted to explore the strategy students adopt when using a certain technology. Okay. All right, and then you want to test to see from the qualitative interviews, you're going to identify the strategies, and then you're going to test that with the outcome that you're aiming at. Yes, that would be exploratory. That would be a sequential exploratory design. You're starting with the qualitative to explore the strategies. You're going to identify the strategies from the qualitative, and then you're going to test that with a quantitative survey to look at the relationship. Okay, so that would be an exploratory sequential design, not explanatory. Okay, and it's not an experiment. It doesn't sound like an experimental. It sounds like a qualitative followed by a correlational study. Okay, I hope that's clear. Okay, so if there's nothing else, we can continue part 3. So now I'm going to look at some sample studies a little bit more in depth. Now I'm going to sort of dissect how they put forward their arguments for their mixed method designs. Okay, so start with the sequential explanatory strategy. Okay, so here's one called How High Schools Become Empowering Communities, a mixed method explanatory inquiry into youth-adult partnership and school engagement. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, the explanatory design starts with quanti and then is followed by quali. Okay, and so here we can see in their study purpose and methodological approach section of the article, they talk about the purpose of the study and the purpose of using their mixed method approach. Okay, so the first is their design for the sequential equal priority rationale. Okay, so it says here, the primary purpose of the study was to gain insight into how high schools can create instructional context for youth engagement and empowerment. We employ a sequential explanatory design, a methodology that allowed us to draw inferences from multiple perspectives and analysis within a single inquiry. Okay, so this is based on a case study. Okay, a case study of a single school. So that's also quite common. You can do mixed method research on, for example, a case study. So you can do the quali and the quanti both in that single case study. Okay, and that is what was done here. In phase 1, okay, so they start with the quantitative portion of the study in phase 1, which is a path analysis to predict their correlational pathways. Okay, so in phase 1, we surveyed high school youth to examine pathways between 3 elements of school climate and engagement. Okay, right, and then they talk about the analysis. It highlighted the centrality of youth voice, blah, 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 blah. All right. And then through case study of an exemplary high school. Okay, so phase 1 is actually a survey with a large sample of students across different high schools. Okay, and then the second phase of the study was a case study of a single school. Okay, so through case study of an exemplary high school, phase 2 sought to describe and explain the pathways from 2 vantage points. Okay, so they want to elaborate on the quantitative findings. In other words, the predictors, right? The predictors, as they say here, they talk about the analysis highlighted the centrality of youth voice in decision making with additional contributions from supportive adults and safety. So those 3 variables were the significant findings from the quantitative. So now they want to do the case study to understand those and to highlight those, to amplify those findings in the case, in the particular, using a particular case study as an example. All right. So to provide depth, to provide depth of understanding of these quantitative pathways or these correlations. All right. And so they're elaborating down here on the qualitative purpose. So they first analyzed the organizational context in which the phase 1 pathways were embedded. Against this backdrop, we then examined student perspectives on their engagement, with an emphasis on identifying those experiences that were most powerful in terms of sparking motivation, curiosity, experimentation. So that's just a rationale for the qualitative part of the study. Okay, so they do a quantitative survey with a large population of students. They get their findings, and then they probe those findings within a single case study. Okay, essentially, that is their design. And here they provide a diagram. Okay, so here they have the quantitative analytic model and results. So this is their path analysis up here. Okay, showing the variables that they tested and the results of the path analysis. And then they show down here phase 2, and they indicate their research questions. Okay, so these are the key aspects. They don't provide the findings here, but they do provide their qualitative questions and a guiding framework. Okay, so they have a guiding theoretical framework, which is these 2 empowered community settings and youth adult partnership. Okay, those are the two theories that they're basing it on. And they have their research questions here for the qualitative. All right. So again, it's just to show the research logic and the research flow. Okay. And it's quite common in mixed method studies to have some sort of diagrammatic representation of how the study is conducted, and even in some cases, the findings. Okay, this is quite common in mixed method studies. Okay, so that is an example of an explanatory approach. Here's an example of a sequential exploratory approach. What matters for urban adolescents' engagement and disengagement in school, a mixed method study. Okay, so I was talking before about school engagement. Now I have an actual study to show you. And again, the sequential exploratory design starts with qualitative, followed by quantitative. Okay, so here the study purpose is presented to us. Collectively, existing engagement research, and there's a whole lot of research on student engagement. There's a massive literature on student engagement. I know because I've studied it myself. And so they have to very clearly identify the gaps in this big body of literature. So they mention here, and this is a good way to really frame a mixed method the need for a mixed method study. Okay, so pay attention to this. Existing engagement research lacks ecologically contextualized studies with the empirical power and qualitative depth to examine how classroom processes affect students' engagement and disengagement in school. Okay, very nice way of presenting the study gap. You know, even though there's this massive literature on school engagement, they highlight the need for both empirical power, i.e. the quantitative portion, as well as the qualitative depth. In other words, they're saying that we lack this combination of these two combined to really understand engagement and disengagement in school. Right? The dearth of literature is particularly notable in secondary school. So now they give us a little bit more detail about the gap. Okay. And then moreover, limited research on how racially and ethnically diverse youth, et cetera, okay? Now, at the bottom here, they say, in response, this study addresses these gaps by using an exploratory mixed method sequential design. The purpose being to examine the contextual factors that influence variations in both students' engagement and disengagement in a racially and economically diverse sample of urban, middle, and high school students. So again, they're getting at the idea of how context affects variations in the relationships. And this is what I was talking about earlier, very early on, about the power of mixed method research, is that it allows us to study context and how context affects these empirical relationships. Okay, and that's exactly what this study is aiming to do. So in order to utilize the strengths of each method, we use a sequential exploratory design to integrate qualitative and quantitative methods. Okay, and they cite Creswell. Okay, everybody likes to cite Creswell. He's very popular. This design is conducted in two phases. Okay, with priority given to the qualitative phase. Now here's an example of a study where the priority is not equal. Okay, so they're giving priority to the qualitative. So they're going to start off with the qualitative, and they really want to understand qualitatively what are these factors. Right, and they're gonna test it quantitatively, but the main focus is on the quality, and they say that. Okay, priority is given to the qualitative phase. In this first phase, we selected a sample of middle and high school urban students who varied in their level of engagement to interview about the meanings and purposes they ascribe to their engagement, disengagement, and school experiences. Okay, so they're going to purposely select a group of students who varied in their level of engagement. Now, of all my qualitative students in the audience today, who can tell me what is the type of sampling mentioned there? We selected a sample of middle and high school urban students who varied in their level of engagement. That hints at what type of sampling approach qualitatively?
Maximum variation.
Maximum variation.
Yay, all right, you guys are awake. Great. Nice to hear the right answer from my students. Thank you, guys. Okay, so yeah, so that's implying, it doesn't say maximum variation, but they're implying there that they're looking at something like a maximum variation sample because they want both perspectives, right? They want both perspectives because qualitatively they're going to probe on why there are those variations. All right. So, okay, so this is in line with Patton's recommendation to purposely select cases at the extreme, okay, because they're more likely to contain rich information. Okay, so that's that maximum variation idea. And then the analytic rationale of the mixed method. So from the interviews, we identified themes related to the motivational and contextual factors that adolescents perceived as influencing their engagement. Okay, so that's the analytic rationale for the quali, okay, for the quali part. Then they talk about the quanti part. In the second phase, we used survey data on motivation, engagement, and contextual factors collected from a larger sample in the same school district to test the predictive associations between those factors identified in the interviews and engagement and disengagement with the larger sample. Okay, so from the quali, they identified the measures, the quantitative measures. Okay, and so here they list the different measures they came up with. Okay, and they mentioned that from the larger list of constructs, we chose specific scales to test in the quantitative analysis that emerged from the interviews around support from teachers, peer support, autonomy, and decision making. So basically from the interviews, they chose those measures that were mentioned in the qualitative part. Okay, so they didn't design their own measures. They did the qualitative study, they got their findings, and then they chose measures from the literature to then test in the quantitative portion of the study. Okay, and so this is the analytic rationale. Okay, and so that's how they provide, and that's it. That's I just want to show the, again, how they explain the rationale for the design that they're using. Okay, and so when you do your study, make sure you have that clear rationale. Okay, if you're doing sequential explanatory, okay, why you're starting with quanti, the purpose of the quali following up, which one is given priority, you know, your sample, etc., etc. Okay, so that all has to be in there. So this is the statement of the research logic, and this is a very important part of any study, but especially a mixed method design, because a mixed method design is more complex, right? And it involves more of the researcher's logic. So you need to explain it to us. Why are you using this approach? How are you formulating and designing the study? Okay, so those are just a couple of examples. There's many more out there you can investigate on your own. So let me again stop there and look at the chat to see what the questions are. Okay, Prof, how about building a model by collecting its components based on literature review and experts interview? And I test the model through a pilot study followed by conducting the model on students. Well, yeah, that would sound, I mean, briefly, that would sound like a mixed method study, sure. Especially, of course, the literature review part is not, but the fact that you are using expert interview, you could argue that that is a mixed method, but your initial qualitative portion, the expert interview, is complementary. It's not the main focus of the study. You know, the priority is given to the quantitative. Okay, so again, you can sort of articulate it that way. All right, Prof, could focus group discussion conducted within control group and experimental group participants to examine? Could focus group discussion conducted within control group and experimental group participants? Lee, I'm not clear about your question. I apologize. Not quite sure what you're getting at in terms of focus group discussion conducted within a control group and experimental group. I don't understand that question. I'm sorry. Natasha asked, Prof, for second phase of sequential explanatory. Okay, how do we filter the participants for the interview? Also, is it recommendable to develop our own questions or adopt from the scholars? Yeah, that's a very good question, Natasha. So yes, so how you select your participants, again, it follows qualitative methodological guidelines, which would be purposive. So what is the criteria? So for example, you may identify, in fact, one of the things that we did recently in a study is when we conducted our quantitative study in the first phase with students, we actually asked in the survey if they would be willing to be involved in a follow-up interview. Okay, and so that's not necessarily a criteria, other than they're willing to participate in an interview. But that is one way to get participants, is that you ask them in the quantitative phase whether they want to be involved in a follow-up qualitative study. But if you want to be more specific in terms of getting the right criterion-based sample, then of course you'd have to have some mechanism based on what it is that you're studying. So for example, if you're looking at the findings, if you're looking at a large population, like in that previous study, they focused on, they didn't say how in that article, how they identified the students that were high and low in engagement, for example. Okay. Now you could get that information from the survey. So for example, if you've collected their ID information, you could identify students who ranked high on certain indicators. So for example, students that scored high on engagement, you could follow up and ask them to participate in the interview, right? Or students that, ranked extremely low on something, you could highlight and target them. Otherwise, other than that, there could be some other related criteria to whatever it is that you're studying. Okay. So if it's related to the finding, you would try to filter them according to their score on that finding, okay, if possible. If it's not possible, if it's just too complicated, maybe your sample's too big or you don't have that identifying information, then it's okay just to look at least to start with, those who have agreed to participate, right, in the interviews, and then from there you can do some screening, okay, so you can ask screening questions and so forth. And that's quite common in most qualitative studies. You have some sort of screening mechanism to determine whether they're going to be appropriate for the study. Okay. Sound is clear. Okay, sorry, Natasha, you don't have sound. I'm not sure why. I think my sound is on. So, all right. Did I answer the questions? If not, please let me know, and I can try to follow up. Okay, so just to continue with the presentation in terms of diagrams, I mentioned that a lot of mixed method studies, they like to use diagrams. There's several studies that use very nice diagrams, not necessarily to display their findings, but to display their method, the methods that they use. So as you can see here, this is a visual diagram of the research design. Okay, very nice way of illustrating the research logic of the study. Okay, so you can see from phase on the left, quantitative data collection, quantitative data analysis, connecting the phases, qualitative data collection, data analysis, mixing. Okay, so this is sequential explanatory design, but then they also have for each phase the procedures, right? So they've outlined the procedures in each phase. Very nice way of doing it. Then you can clearly see the methods that have been employed. And then not only that, they don't stop there, they even have the product of each phase. Okay, so each phase ends up with a particular product. Okay, so you have your numeric data, your descriptive influential statistics, and then 8 interview participants recruited through maximum variation sampling. Again, their choice here of maximum variation sampling based on, as you can see here, this relates to your question, Natasha. Okay, based on survey scores, based on the quantitative data they collected, they identified the variety of participants. Okay, so that maximum variation was based on the quantitative findings. So again, that's how you can do it as well. Like I mentioned, you can base it on the quantitative findings. But of course, it requires you to do some data mining to identify those people that score on high and low on certain things. Okay, and then they have their transcriptions of the interviews, the textual data, codes, categories, and themes, and then conclusions and implications. Okay, so this is a very nice sort of map of the mixed method approach, the sequential approach. All right. Here's another one, very similar approach used. Students' persistence in a distributed doctoral program in educational leadership in higher education, a mixed method study. Okay, and they used the exact same format. Okay, so this is a very popular format for illustrating mixed method, especially sequential mixed method design. The embedded or the parallel designs are a bit more difficult to illustrate because they're more iterative. They go hand in hand, they go back and forth. They're not as linear as the sequential designs, so they're a bit harder to illustrate. Okay, so here though we can see again the design steps, the phases, the procedures, and the products. Okay, now this is also a very good tool for mapping your own study. Okay, so you could do this even for your own proposal, for your methodology, okay? And in fact, I would highly encourage you to do this, right? Map out your methodology accordingly with this design phase, okay, and the order of the phases, the procedures in each phase, and then the products, what you expect to get from each phase, okay? If you can do this, I think it'll really, really help you to visualize your own study and plan. This is essentially a roadmap. This is a plan of how the study is going to be conducted and what you're going to get from each phase. Okay, so I highly recommend everyone to do this if you're using a sequential design. All right. This is now this is an example of a diagrammatic view of the findings, and a lot of mixed method study, they just present their findings. They'll present the quantitative findings wherever they are, and then they'll present the qualitative findings. So very in the same way they present them in standalone studies, you know, so they'll present the quantitative tables and then the qualitative themes and all that. There are some, like this one, they try to provide a more visual view. So this would be the, this is the visual illustration of the path analysis. This is a mediation model. Okay, so the structural model with the path coefficients. So this is the quantitative finding. Okay, and then later in the study, they present the integrated finding. Okay, so in this part here, phase 2 is the integrated finding. So it's the same model, however, the IVs are now only 4, not 5, because in the quantitative finding, one of the 5 IVs was not significant. This one here with the dotted line is not significant. So in phase 2, they only present the 4 significant findings, and they've added the qualitative findings under each, because the purpose of this study was the qualitative followed the quantitative. The qualitative was used to expound on or further explain the quantitative findings. So they have the quantitative finding here at the top, and then the qualitative themes under each one, okay? And so this is an integrated model of both the qualitative and quantitative findings, okay? And so it's just a way of displaying the integrated model at the end of the study, okay? But not all mixed method studies do this, okay? So this is one study. Some do, some don't. It depends. But of course, diagrams always help, especially in bigger, more complicated studies. If you can diagram out your findings, visuals are really helpful for a lot of people. Okay, so we are just about finished. Just the last thing I would just want to talk on, mention is on planning your own mixed method study, okay? And nothing really new here, only that I want to reiterate. I want to reiterate these 4 guiding questions, okay, because this is really where it begins. Okay, go back to these 4 guiding questions. Make sure you can clearly answer these 4 guiding questions before you embark on your mixed method study. This will help you immensely in terms of being clear as to what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. Okay, because the why influences the what. Why you're doing it is going to influence what you do. Okay, so what is the rationale? Okay, what is your study being dictated by? Okay, is it the research questions? Is it the objectives? Is it the need to complement one or the other? Okay, so start with this clear idea or rationale. Just a note, that study that I presented before on the youth associations that we did in Malaysia, that study was dictated by the questions we had, the research questions, but we also, the document analysis, policy analysis part, actually we added in later. And the reason we did that is because we realized midway through the study that before we even got to the interviews with our youth leaders, that there was another body of data there that was actually impacting the youth leaders' decisions as managers of the associations. Okay, and so mixed methods also can have an evolving design aspect to it, like qualitative research. Okay, and so we actually added that policy part sort of midway through because we realized that it was important. And so that can also, of course, guide the rationale. Okay, sometimes there's this emerging design element to it. Okay, what is the structure and then making that decision about how your methods are going to be integrated. Okay, how are you going to integrate the methods? Which one is going to get priority? All right, and why? Always ask the question, why? Why am I doing it this way? Why am I doing it this way? Why am I doing it this way? Okay, make sure you're clear about that. Okay, and then function. Again, what is the goal? Convergence, complementariness. I don't know what the word is in English. Expanding on findings, trying to explain findings in a more in-depth manner. Developing an instrument, is it for sampling? Okay, again, what is the specific function? And then lastly, what is the process? How will you merge your data sets together? Will they connect? Will they be sequential? Will they be embedded? Okay. So like all good research, you must ask good starting questions. Okay, all research is driven by good questions. Okay, so make sure you ask those questions. Okay, and then of course, consider the four main factors. Consider your theoretical perspective. All right, is there a clear theory that you're building on, that you're working from? And does that influence your choice of method? Okay, or is there very little in terms of theory in terms of the topic you're studying? Okay, and then of course, priority of strategy. All right, equal priority, qualitative, quantitative. All right, sequence, which one goes first and why? Or do they complement each other? And then lastly, at which point are you going to integrate the data? Again, if it's sequential, it's going to be at the level of interpretation. If it's parallel, it'll probably come earlier during data collection or analysis. All right, or it may have some combination. Okay, but you need to really consider where and how you're going to integrate your data. So again, if you do that map, that design map that I showed those two examples of, that will really help you again to think through and to conceptualize the logic of your study. Okay, so I highly encourage you to do that. So in terms of planning your own study, an appropriate design based on those questions that I just mentioned. Your research questions, of course, are of ultimate importance. Research questions, the strategies to be used for each part of the study. Okay, so within qualitative and within quantitative, what methods are you going to use? What is your analytical approach going to be? So for example, are you going to do a case study? Are you going to do phenomenological inquiry? Is it going to be just a generic content analysis? Those are also design considerations that have to be considered, right? And then how you go about mixing the data. All right, so these are the main considerations for your planning of your mixed method study. Okay, and I believe that is the end. Okay, so let's see. Are there any other questions here? Let's see. How many did I miss here in the chat box? Let's see. Sound. Okay, so let's see. Good asked, Prof, to follow up Natasha's question. After receiving the survey quantitative data, I could shortlist my sample of study for the interview session. Yes. My question: how many is the equal or applicable interview session do I need to conduct the mixed method? Yeah, again, the number of interviews will. I mean, in most cases, it's no different than a qualitative study. You know, you want to at least approach saturation in most cases. But there, you know, you'll find in some mixed method studies they don't do that. They pre-identify a number based on some criteria that they found in the literature, or you know, it also depends on what is the purpose of the quality. What I would say is that if qualitative, like in that study I showed before, where they start with qualitative and they follow by quanti. In that study, qualitative was the priority. So in a study where the qualitative is the priority, you definitely should you know, follow the saturation rule. You know, it should be a complete qualitative study. If qualitative is just complementary, then there has to be some other criteria, and there is no clear-cut criteria for that. Okay, but you know, I would go to the literature to always find similar studies in terms of design to what you're doing, and look at the rationale that they give for that, because it's going to depend on the particular study. Because again, if it's a case study, right, that number of research of respondents may be based on the fact that within the particular case, there just aren't that many to interview, right? So that's dictated by the particular type of qualitative study they're doing, you know, and on the population really that they're studying. So the sample is dictated by that. Okay, so I don't think there's a general rule for this. You have to really look at what kind of study you're doing, the qualitative parameters of what you're studying. Okay, there are different considerations. Okay, but I would refer to the literature, find similar study in terms of design, and look at what they use as criteria. Okay, but if you're using qualitative as the main, as the prioritized of the two methods, then definitely I would recommend following the saturation rule. In MMR, is it compulsory to mention the qualitative design, or can we just conduct the qualitative scan without? No, you can do. No, you don't have to. It's not compulsory. You can just do generic. Use a generic design, or you can just mention you conducted qualitative interviews for the purpose of. Okay, again, that purpose needs to be clear. But it is not compulsory. It is not compulsory. Okay. Okay. Any additional questions, further questions, follow-up questions? Oh, Rahma, I skipped your question. Oh, sorry. How did I skip your question? Okay. How about building a module by collecting its components based on literature review and expert interview? Yeah, I thought I answered that question. Then I test the module through pilot study, followed by conducting that module on students. Is it mixed method? Yeah, as I mentioned, it would most likely be mixed method, yeah. But again, it sounds like you're giving priority to the quantity. The quality, of course, literature review is not qualitative, but the fact you have expert interviews can be used as a justification for a mixed method research, but it would not be, clearly would not be given equal weight. That would be prioritizing the quality, prioritizing the quantity, and the expert interviews are more of a complementary method. Okay, so I would definitely suggest it according to that.
Sorry, Prof. But
Yeah.
my question is, what can we call this design? What kind of a mixed method design?
Yeah,
This my
it
question.
is. You're starting with it would be sequential exploratory, okay, but you are the quantitative phase is given priority. You're prioritizing the quantitative phase. So the exploratory phase is limited only to expert interviews.
So it will be sequential exploratory, yeah?
Yes, but yeah, it would. But again, you have to emphasize the weightage, the priority, because if you don't mention,
the priority will be on quantity.
Yes, the priority on quantity.
Yeah.
That has to be clearly spelled out. That has to be clearly spelled out, because if people just look at the fact that you're doing exploratory qualitative, exploratory sequential, they will look for those two clear phases, and you have them, but you need to explain how that first phase with the expert interviews qualifies as a complementary element of the sequential design.
Prof. Lateef?
Yeah, Prof. Siti.
Yeah, in some way of writing, they write small qual, big quant. When we explain that, you just have to write this design, blah, blah, and then it's with a small qual, small qualitative, and big quantitative. That's the way I saw they write that way. So it's
That's like I showed earlier. Her model, that's what she does. So she uses the capital, the big quant and the small qual to indicate. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you.
Yep. Thanks, Prof. Siti. Okay, any other questions? No. Okay, well, if not, then thank you everyone for attending. I hope it was informative. And all the best with everyone's research. Best of luck. And look forward for the third. There will be a third intellectual discourse presentation on mixed method research in the coming weeks by Dr. Nasnor. Will be. I think his session is going to do a bit more of the comparing the all the different designs. He's going to be doing some comparing and contrasting. And so I think that might be very helpful for students that are trying to make decisions about this type of stuff for your own research. Okay. So, alhamdulillah, thank you very much. And inshallah, we'll see you again in the future. Thank you, Mr. Haikal. Thank you, Putra Classroom, for inviting me. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Prof. Abdul Lateef, for the informational sharing. I hope that all the knowledge that has been shared will give benefits to all of us. I would like to thank all the participants that have joined today's webinar, and I wish you have a good day ahead, and please stay safe. Thank you. The link attendance form will be given in chat box, so you all can fill the form to get the NE certificate. Thank you, everyone.